Welcome to my lecture series on Kant. Well, welcome back, I should say, because this is part 3. If you've missed part 2 and part 1, it's going to be nearly impossible to understand what's going on here. I guess I can look at my notes here just briefly to summarize. I don't want to waste everyone's time that's already been through this, but part 1 is the architecture of the mind and the boundary of reason. Part 1 teaches about the fundamental mechanics of Kant's Copernican revolution, arguing that the mind does not passively record an external world like a blank slate, but it actively constructs reality through innate a priori frameworks. It's all of the Kantian scholarship. Part 1 is really a deep dive into all of the Kantian concepts. It's really a meditation on Kantian concepts. It demonstrates that our sensibility dictates the pure forms of space and time, while our understanding imposes the categories such as causality and substance to bind raw sensory data into a coherent objective manifold. And crucially, this part teaches the necessity of the noumenal limit, or the nominal, the noumena, okay? Well, we can only know the world as it appears to us, which is phenomenon, never as it is in its actual self. That's the noumena. So in part 1, I insist this is not a tragic defeat of reason, but a vital protective barrier. By proving that the theoretical reason cannot penetrate the noumena, the noumenal void, to prove or disprove God or immortality. So Kant successfully protects this space for human freedom and moral autonomy against the deterministic laws of physics. Again, it's a complete, if you ever really wanted to know about Kantian concepts, that is a deep dive, and it actually takes me 3 parts to unfold and unpack. Part 2 was the biological priesthood, substrate coherence, okay? So the underlying of all of this. So part 2 teaches us that Kant's, Kant's deduced a priori structures are not mere philosophical abstractions, but they also find a direct phenomenal correlate in observable neurobiology, of the mammalian brain. Under the principle of substrate coherence, this is something Jordan Peterson loves to talk about. Part 2 illustrates that the medial entorhinal cortex, the hexagonal lattice of grid cells, physically instantiates the pure intuition of space, while the comprehensive forward projecting theta phase procession in the hippocampus generates the form of inner time. It teaches that the mind is a preformatted canvas geared toward predictive coherence. However, in part 2, it establishes a strict philosophical firewall as well. It warns that the brain's anatomy is merely the physical vehicle for freedom, not the transcendental cause of it. So, you will learn that mistaking the biological substrate for the nominal will itself is a catastrophic category error. And that's very important, because all of the philosophical people that are going to jump on this and then, they're going to say, oh, well, you're misrepresenting Kant and blah, 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 blah. But this is for you. Like, part 2 is a deep dive. If what I just said about part 2 makes you feel like, what the hell is this guy talking about? I take a lot of time to unpack this stuff and to give you, places where you can research this stuff, just to show that there is a parallel between, the findings in neurobiology, in the sciences, of the mammalian brain, which is mammals, that's us, and Kantian concepts. It's another deep dive into the phenomenal and noumenal, and it leads us here where we are now today, which is part 3, the Apodictic Imago Dei. Okay, and this is going to be about the moral navigator here. I'm happy you're here with me. This is going to be I'm quite excited about this because this is going to bring my thoughts to a crescendo. And we're going to start off first with the apodictic ground of moral reason. So this was written on a matriculation record from March 1780 in Kant's own handwriting. To the canon, the end of the whole of metaphysics is God, and the future and the end of these in our conduct, not as though morality must be arranged in accordance with these, but because without these, morality would be without consequences. And when he says to the canon, he is talking about the canon of philosophy. And if you don't know a lot about philosophy, I'll tell you right now, you're in deep trouble. Because in order to understand, if you're going to read Nietzsche, if you're going to read Heidegger, if you're going to read anybody like Foucault, if you're going to dive into any of these thinkers, Kant, Descartes, anybody, they're all referencing a particular canon. They're all talking about guys that have already written things that are already in their books. It is a canon to itself, just like horror is a genre. Okay, philosophy is not a genre; it's a canon. The ideas are shared between thinkers throughout time. I mean, this is a great Hegelian revelation. Okay, so now, in dealing with Kant, his quote here, to the canon, the end of the whole of metaphysics is God, and the future and the end of these in our conduct, not as though morality must be arranged in accordance with these, but because without these, morality would be without consequences. Okay? If he's saying, like, this is the reason why we have morality built into our structure is because of God. This notion made during the gestation of the Critique of Pure Reason confirms the architectonic purpose of Kant's critical enterprise. His goal was not the negation of metaphysics, but its redirection from failed theoretical dogmatism to a secure, practical foundation. The three critiques systematically demarcate the limits of theoretical reason precisely to establish the necessary domain of practical reason, where freedom, the immortality of the soul, and God are not proved as facts of knowledge, but postulated as necessary conditions of moral life. As Kant establishes in the Critique of Practical Reason, these postulates are inextricable from the moral law, which is a fact of pure reason itself. Without them, the highest good, the proportional union of virtue and happiness demanded by our reason, becomes a conceptual impossibility, rendering moral striving ultimately incoherent. So now we arrive at a convergence that Kant could not have anticipated, but which his system logically allows. This alignment is neither coincidence nor category error. It is the necessary outcome of what we may term the principle of substrate coherence. For a transcendental condition to be operable within a finite, embodied, rational being, it will find its phenomenal instantiation in a correlative functional structure within the biological substrate, and that would be our brain. The logical necessity remains transcendentally, prior. The biological machinery is the contingent but exhaustive physical vehicle through which that logical requirement can be made effective in the empirical world. The cognitive architecture is the physical vehicle through which logical requirements are articulated, not their cause. We cannot prove space is a priori because we discovered grid cells. However, we can say that if rational navigation requires an innate spatial metric, the grid cell lattice demonstrates one phenomenal means by which an embodied finite reasoner meets this transcendental condition. The logical necessity remains a transcendental deduction. The neural mechanism is an empirical confirmation of coherence, not a proof of necessity. This mapping of subpersonal machinery to the personal transcendental subject reveals that the formal structures of cognition and moral deliberation are observable as distributed networks in the human brain. Okay, this is why it's so important to learn about Kant first in part 1, and then learn about Kant and the parallel between the neurobiology of the mammalian brain, the brain that's inside of mammals. It's staggeringly important, and actually it brings you into what I'm talking about right now. And this is what I'm doing, is I'm trying to confirm what we've went through the part 1 and part 2. And I'm going to, this is so exciting for me to share this with you. The formal structures of cognition and moral deliberation, which Kant derived transcendentally as the a priori conditions of experience and agency, are now observable as the functional architecture of the human brain. This is not a reduction of the noumenal to the phenomenal. It is the empirical discovery of the phenomenal substrate whose operation is consistent with and required by transcendental analysis. Obviously, if we're going to think, we have to think from our brains. Number 1, the forms of intuition and the neural manifold. Kant argued that space and time are pure forms of sensible intuition, the preconditions for any experience. The discovery of grid cells in the entorhinal cortex, neurons that fire in a hexagonal lattice mapping spatial environment, this provides a neurobiological basis for the a priori form of space as an organizing framework for navigation. This lattice is not space itself, but the innate experiential metric system the brain imposes on sensory data. Number 2, the unity of apperception and the default mode network. The transcendental unity of apperception, the I think, that must be able to accompany all my representations, is the cornerstone of Kant's theoretical philosophy. The default mode network, the DMN, a brain system active during self-referential thought, prospection and coherent narrative integration. It finds a phenomenological resonance in, though it must be reduced to, its physiological correlate. It generates the unified self-model that is the necessary ground for a continuous field of experience and for conceiving oneself as an enduring moral agent. Number 3, the moral law and prefrontal orchestration. The categorical imperative is a law of autonomous reason, not a discovered feature of nature. However, the capacity to formulate universal maxims, suppress immediate inclination in favor of an abstract principle, and engage in long-term value-based planning is enabled by evolved neural systems. Theta phase precession in the hippocampus facilitates the temporal binding of events into coherent sequences. That's the schematism of agency. While ventromedial and dorsal prefrontal cortices, in concert with the anterior cingulate cortex, perform the conflict monitoring, cost-benefit analysis over extended horizons, and rule-based deliberation that characterize moral reasoning. Again, if it sounds absolutely insane, because I can only imagine if you just tune into this and you're listening and you're like, what? You know, rewind it, take some of the phrases, punch it into Google, take your phone and play it into another phone on the AI and just confirm this stuff. Or better yet, listen to part 1 and part 2. Okay, so moving on to objection and resolution. The naturalistic fallacy charge. This argument does not derive ought from is. It demonstrates that the is of our cognitive machinery is precisely configured to facilitate the phenomenal realization of the ought discovered by reason. The ought remains an irreducible formal principle of freedom. The brain supplies the physiological vehicle through which that principle is translated into action. The moral law remains a formal principle of freedom. Neuroscience reveals the phenomenal machinery of deliberation, not the noumenal ground of obligation. Dignity resides in our capacity to legislate the law, not in the neurons that enable the deliberation. The Humean gap preserved. The gulf between factual statements and moral commands remains absolute in logic. However, the brain is not merely a logic engine. It is an embodied reasoning system whose highest order function is to resolve the conflict between discrete facts and holistic value frameworks. A physiological manifestation of the problem Kant's philosophy solves. Kant's dualism upheld. The convergence does not collapse the noumenal phenomenal distinction. Instead, it enriches our understanding of the phenomenal side. We are, in our observable nature, beings whose very biology is organized for freedom. As Kant states in the groundwork, rational nature exists as an end in itself. Our neuroarchitecture is that of an end-setting being. The confirmed imperative. Kant's project was to translate the Imago Dei, the idea of humanity as bearing inherent, infinite worth, from a tenet of faith into an apodictic truth of practical reason. He succeeded by showing that moral obligation is the first fact of rational consciousness. The 21st century science does not replace this, but corroborates its necessity by showing that the only known entity capable of such reason, the human being, possesses a brain whose fundamental operational principles are systematic unity, predictive coherence, and value-based projection. The postulates of God and immortality secure the conceptual possibility of the highest good. Our neural architecture reveals that we are, in our very constitution, orientated towards its pursuit. Therefore, the canon is affirmed. The end of metaphysics is indeed the guarantee of moral consequence. We find that guarantee not in a theological assertion beyond reason, but in the reasoned postulates of practical life, now reflected in the coherent structure of the organ that thinks them. We are not merely biological accidents. We are the physical instantiation of a logical necessity, beings for whom the moral law is both the voice of freedom and the deep grammar of our own thought. This 4-part lecture series rests on the secure foundation provided by 2 outstanding modern commentaries on Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. These works have served as indispensable guides offering rigorous scholarly insight, which, while remaining remarkably clear and approachable, qualities we aspire to emulate here. The first one is the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, edited by Paul Guyer, Cambridge University Press, 2010. It assembles leading Kant scholars to examine every major division of the critique. Its chapters illuminate historical background, unpack central arguments, and trace the work's profound influence across subsequent philosophy, from German idealism to contemporary analytic and continental traditions. Routledge Philosophy Guidebook to Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason by Sebastian Gardner, Routledge, 1999. This provides a patient, section-by-section companion to the text itself. Gardner's exposition is admirably lucid, carefully balancing fidelity to Kant's technical architecture with an inviting narrative that welcomes both first-time and returning readers. And you can actually watch a YouTube series on this. It's about 60 parts long, and it's by Professor Victor Jespers. I watched it. It was excellent. And I actually, if you want to dive into Kant, in a way through his books, I would suggest starting there. And then second, go to Robert Paul Wolff to see his lectures. And then finally, the magnificent and amazing Daniel N. Robinson, who just captivated me. I mean, it's the reason why he's probably the biggest influence why I love Kant so much. All right. So anyways, back to my lecture series. Okay. So those books, which are the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and the Routledge Philosophy Guidebook to Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, together with the refined translations of the Cambridge edition of the works of Immanuel Kant, especially the 2025 updating of the Critique of Pure Reason under Paul Guyer's general editorship, these commentaries ensure that our exploration remains grounded in the finest contemporary scholarship. They have helped strip away unnecessary jargon, clarify persistent misunderstandings, and represent Kant's revolutionary ideas in contemporary English accessible to lay readers without sacrificing the depth or precision. I will say this again. I said it in my Plato series. I said it in the Heidegger series. Translations matter. I mean, they really do. The nuances build, all the nuances build into the great depth of the writer itself. So please do your research on who your translators are before, diving into these books. I'd also like to gratefully acknowledge these guiding works as the scholarly scaffolding for this series. With their support, we have followed this revelation across 2 prior lectures. That's in part 1. Again, we mapped the majestic edifice of the 3 critiques. And in part 2, we witnessed philosophy's proclaimed death transformed into the physiological resurrection. Kant's transcendental forms of intuition finding their phenomenal correlate in the hexagonal lattice of grid cells. The categories and schematism mirrored in the theta phase procession, the moral law's primacy instantiated in entorhinal prefrontal coupling that privileges far-sighted virtue across the temporal manifold. Metaphysics is not disembodied abstraction. It finds its phenomenal expression in the biological, woven into the very neurology of predictive navigation, the systematic intentionality that binds perception, memory, and agency into coherent moral aspiration. To protest that this convergence conflates science and theology is to misunderstand both. The lattice system is not mere mechanism. It is the silent enactment of rational order, the physiological scripture of systematic unity. The navigating brain does not reduce dignity, it discloses it. We are inescapably the moral animal, creatures whose intrinsic value emerges not from external decree, but from the necessary structure of consciousness itself. We are weighing every rational act toward universal law. Kant saw this unity clearly. In the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, he insists that rational nature exists as an end in itself, that the human person, as a unified subject of apperception and autonomous legislator, bears absolute worth. The unity of consciousness is not accidental. It is the ground of moral freedom, the intrinsic value that elevates humanity above mere inclination. Whether we name this ground physicality or spirit or biology or divine imagination, the convergence remains. We are made in the image of systematic coherence itself. We stand now at the series' culmination, the apodictic moral certitude, moralische Gewissheit of the Imago Dei, Imago, the Imago Dei, again, Latin, okay, it's going to kill me. The image of God is no longer contested faith or speculative hope. Enriched by physiosophia, it emerges as undeniable certainty, the rational navigator, finite, fallible, yet constitutively ordered toward moral wholeness. This bears within its living structure the image of creation's systematic unity. The apodictic bridge from substrate coherence to practical certitude. The principle of substrate coherence, as we have formulated it here, states that any transcendental condition necessary for finite rational experience will find its phenomenal instantiation in a corresponding functional structure within the embodied substrate that enables its phenomenal realization. This principle is not a reduction. It is a consistency requirement. The a priori forms and categories remain logically prior, established by transcendental argument alone. Yet their empirical instantiation in the human brain is not accidental. It is the sole known natural system capable of sustaining the very operations that pure reason declares necessary. When we extend this principle of the domain of practical reason, the implications become decisive. The moral law, as Kant demonstrates in the second critique, is a fact of reason, an apodictic practical cognition that commands unconditionally. Its execution, however, requires a rational being capable of 1, formulating universal maxims. 2, inhibiting inclination in favor of duty. And 3, projecting actions across an extended temporal horizon toward a coherent highest good in which virtue and happiness are proportioned. 21st century neuroscience reveals that the human brain is uniquely architectured to perform precisely these operations. The entorhinal hippocampal latus, together with prefrontal orchestration, does not merely support navigation in physical space. It constitutes a predictive, value-laden simulation engine that binds past, present, and prospective future into unified trajectories governed by abstract rules. The categorical imperative is not an optional cultural overlay. It is the functional principle by which this system achieves long-term coherence against immediate impulse, to act heteronomously, to subordinate universal law to self-love. It is not merely immoral. It is to introduce desynchronization into the very substrate that makes rational agency possible. Thus, the postulates of practical reason, freedom, immortality, and God are not theoretical assertions about objects of possible experience. They remain, as Kant insisted, objects of rational faith. Yet their necessity is now illuminated from the side of the phenomenal substrate, the only known biological system capable of moral deliberation is one whose deepest operational grammar demands the conceptual possibility of a realm in which virtue is ultimately rewarded. Without the postulates, the highest good becomes not merely unattainable, but incoherent within the predictive architecture itself. The brain's constitutive drive towards systematic, proportionate unity across infinite horizons renders the moral worldview not a hopeful addition, but the only framework consistent with its own functioning. In the precise sense, the traditional doctrine of the Imago Dei ceases to be an article of contested revelation and becomes the apodictic truth of practical reason corroborated by the structure of the sole embodied rational agent we know. Human dignity is no longer defended against skepticism by faith alone. It is disclosed as the necessary implication of the coherent operation of reason in nature. We are, in our observable constitution, beings that are formatted for freedom and orientated toward the moral order. The image of God is not superadded to our nature. It is the transcendental practical signature inscribed in the living lattice that makes us rational animals at all. The brain evolved to solve adaptive survival problems, not to guarantee a heavenly reward. However, the very same predictive machinery that enabled survival now enables the transcendence of survival through the capacity for self-legislation. The postulate of the highest good is the regulative projection of this machinery, not the constitutive discovery of a metaphysical fact. Our Paleolithic ancestors survived not because they consciously grasped the categorical imperative, but because natural selection, operating blindly, favored phenotype traits. Delayed gratification, social trust, prefrontal inhibition, and long-term foresight that functionally prefigured the very capacities Kant would later identify as the preconditions for rational moral agency. The prehistoric tribe was not literally the kingdom of ends, but it operated as if it were one, because any tribe that failed to suppress immediate heteronomous impulse in favor of group coherence simply perished. We are not the descendants of Kantian philosophers. We are the descendants of those whose neurobiology made Kantian philosophy possible. All right, so we're going into the introduction, and that's the stillness and the revelation. There is a stillness that hangs over the old city of Königsberg, a quietude that seems to emanate from the very cobblestones where Immanuel Kant took his famously punctual walks. It is the stillness of a life of relentless intellectual labor, lived not in withdrawal from the world, but in desperate immersion into the only frontier that could possibly save it: the architecture of the human mind itself. For centuries, the boundary he drew between the knowable phenomenal world and the unknowable noumenal realm was viewed as a tragic exile, an intellectual suffocation. Yet we now see that Kant's limitation, a theoretical reason, was no defeat. It was a necessary clearing, a dismantling of dogmatic glass palaces to protect the only realm that truly matters: autonomous moral agency. This lecture is not an attempt to alter Kant. It is not to bend his concepts into something convenient or new. I stand before his edifice in awe, as others have stood, but with a different purpose. I do not seek to write my own philosophy over his. I seek to share what I have found in Kant, in neuroscience, in scripture, and in the earnest faith that has grown from their convergence. This is my presentation of Physiosophia. If you have if you have listened to the earlier parts of this work, you have seen how I represented Kant on reality's terms, guided by those who have made his thought accessible with integrity. Now, set the representation aside. I am not speaking for Kant. I am speaking from what Kant made possible to see. And what I have found in this: we are species biologically and transcendentally bound to navigate by the divine image. We are built to worship. The same structural drive that orients us toward the highest goodwill, if misdirected. It latches onto money, sex, fame, or any pinnacle of earthly pleasure, and in doing so, reduce us to sophisticated animals enslaved by our own inclinations. This is heteronomy. Its opposite is not mere rule following, but reciprocity, treating humanity in ourselves and others always as an end, never merely as a means. Here we arrive at the core claim of Physiosophia. According to the principle of substrate coherence, every transcendental condition required for experience, the forms of intuition, the unity of self-consciousness, the moral law, and even the harmonious free play of aesthetic judgment, all of these will find their phenomenal instantiation in a corresponding functional architecture in our physical biology. This convergence, now empirically traceable, reveals that our minds are exquisitely formatted engines of coherence, built to demand the highest good. The categorical imperative is not an abstract law. It is the core formal procedure of moral cognition, requiring systemic unity across time. Even the experience of beauty, as Kant discerned, arises from a free yet ordered integration of faculties, a coherence that mirrors the mind's constitutive drive toward purposeful order. A note on teleology and biology. Okay, so for listeners of part 1 and part 2, a crucial distinction must be held regarding the origins of our neural architecture. When we state that natural selection operated as a blind process to favor, phenotypic traits like prefrontal inhibition, we are describing the phenomenal mechanics of biology. Evolution is the blind shipwright gathering the wood. However, when we refer to the intelligent design or the teleological orientation of the human mind, we are not speaking of a biological mechanic, okay? But of the architectonic nature of reason itself. The biology is blind, but the transcendental structure it ultimately instantiates, the capacity for universal law giving and the drive towards the highest good, this is profoundly purposeful. Physiosophia recognizes that the blind mechanics of the phenomenal world were precisely what was required to build a finite vessel capable of bearing the Apodictic Imago Dei. What I have found is not a retreat from this principle, but its fulfillment. The divine command we have sought externally has always been present as the constitutive telos of our rational nature, orientating us toward freedom. Our biology provides the phenomenal machinery to pursue this coherence, but it is the transcendental structure of practical reason that formats us for freedom. The certainty we speak of does not lie in a direct empirical view of a nominal entity under a microscope or an fMRI scan. The certainty lies entirely in the design of the compass, not in a direct observation of the magnetic pole. And here a Kantian boundary must be stated with full seriousness. We cannot say we act morally because God commands it. That would reduce morality to a calculation of reward and punishment, destroying the purity of the goodwill. We must be fearless in confronting this tension, for if the moral law is to remain absolutely pure, if its motive force cannot be calculation of heavenly reward or earthly punishment, then we are left with a profound existential vacuum. How can a finite, fallible, suffering being endure the unrelenting demand of the categorical imperative without some assurance that the moral order is ultimately real? Yet the instant we attempt to resolve this vacuum theoretically, we collide with the absolute limit of our cognitive architecture. Henry Bergson, in his masterful critique of the intellect, drew a crucial distinction between duration, durée, the lived qualitative flowing experience of time as we directly apprehend it, and the spatialized time of the scientific intellect, which freezes the flow into discrete, measurable instants ordered along a line. The moment we qualitate that durée, the moment we attempt to freeze it into a determinate structure, to submit it to the categories of the understanding, we are immediately thrust back into the transcendental grid of Kantian space and time. We cannot step outside the phenomenal manifold to observe the nominal hand that guides it. The intellect, as Bergson showed, is a practical tool for action in the spatial world. It is utterly incapable of grasping the metaphysical reality of will's origination. Our own inner life is forever opaque to its own ultimate ground. It is precisely at this impenetrable boundary that the Pauline challenge of Romans 9 confronts us. It does not depend on the man who wills or the man who runs, but on God who has mercy. What is the ontological status of this claim? Is the will truly self-legislating, or are we vessels being shaped by an absolute eternal decree? The transcendental structure of our own reason cannot answer this. We cannot know if our destiny is written, if our moral striving is a divine plan, or if it is no more or less than an evolved imagination, a valued outcome of a biological substrate, a convenient postulate we impose upon ourselves to avoid despair. The question is strictly beyond the bounds of possible experience. It is a deep, primordial conundrum, and it is radically, unyieldingly unknowable. And here, precisely at this epistemological limit, the mature philosophy of Friedrich Schelling offers us a vital distinction, not a solution, but as a way of holding the mystery. Schelling distinguished between negative philosophy and positive philosophy. Negative philosophy is the formal, transcendental architecture of what can be thought. The Kantian map of the a priori structures of cognition. It establishes the necessary conditions for any possible experience, including the moral experience of obligation. But negative philosophy, by its own rigorous method, cannot tell us why this architecture exists, nor can it ground the actual living reality of the thinking subject. It can give us the form of the will, but not the existence of the will. Positive philosophy, by contrast, does not begin from logic or categories. It begins from the sheer, irreducible actuality of existence. The that which is, prior to all conceptual determination. For Schelling, this actuality is not a thing, but a free, self-revealing God who condescends to enter history. Positive philosophy is not a theoretical proof. It is a receptive attitude, a willingness to receive the revelation of the divine ground as it gives itself. This is precisely the realm of Romans 9, the potter's sovereignty over the clay, the absolute gratuity of existence, and the gift of the will's capacity to choose. But, and this is crucial, positive philosophy does not negate negative philosophy. It does not annihilate autonomy. It simply shows that the formal law of reason, negative, is the phenomenal expression of a deeper living ground, positive. The two do not conflict. They are complementary moments of a single rational faith that cannot be fully grasped by the intellect alone. But this positive ground remains forever beyond our theoretical grasp. We cannot, from the inside of our own phenomenal consciousness, determine whether our sense of freedom is a genuine participation in the divine or a mere projection of our biological impulses. We cannot look at our own brain and see the hand of the potter. We cannot peer into the nominal realm and read the eternal decrees. The question of whether our morality is nothing more than a subjective reward system or whether it is the echo of a divine plan is strictly indecidable by reason. It is a genuine antinomy, a conflict of reason within itself that can only be resolved by an act of the will, not by an argument. And here, exactly at this threshold, the resolution appears, not as a theoretical answer, but as a practical, as existential choice. Which glass do you drink from? If you choose the empty glass, you must accept the moral law is a fiction, an evolutionary appendix, a heroic but groundless projection of human imagination. You must bear the burden of the categorical imperative without any assurance that the universe ultimately cares. If that is your path, then peace be with you on your journey. But if you choose the full glass, and you do so not because you can prove it, but because you recognize that the formal structure of your own reason demands the possibility of the highest good, and because you freely decide to orientate your life toward that possibility, then the moral law is not merely a fact of reason. It is a finite echo of the infinite. It becomes the regulative pole of a soul that yearns for its source. The full glass is not a theoretical claim about predestination. It is an act of faith in the ultimate coherence of the moral order. It is the decision to treat the nominal ground of freedom as a living personal God, even though we cannot see him. If you choose that glass, then how could our rational nature, in its deepest architectonic, be anything other than Imago Dei? For the very structure of our reason, its capacity for universal law giving, its synthetic unity, its orientation toward the highest good, it all bears the unmistakable signature of divine logos. The image of God is not a biological datum. It is a transcendental practical necessity, the only framework that renders coherent the moral life of a rational being. This choice is not a contradiction of Kant's purity. It is the moment where the formal negative philosophy of Kant, the map of the mind, cedes its theoretical sovereignty to the positive philosophy of Schelling, the living, self-revealing ground. But that revelation does not arrive as a proof. It arrives as a faithful act of the will. The empty glass leads to the abyss of postmodern despair, to the quiet nihilism of a will that legislates for itself, but has no ultimate reason to do so. The full glass, freely chosen, leads to the kenosis of a child recognizing their father. And in that recognition, the moral law finds its ultimate, luminous resolution. Thus, the quiet words Kant scribbled on a matriculation record in March 1780 find their luminous resolution. And I'll say it again. The end of the whole of metaphysics is God and the future, because without these, morality would be without consequences. So, the end of all metaphysics is secured not as an external dictate to fear, but as the internal regulative poles of a moral navigation system whose biological reality we now trace. Our minds are, by their constitutive logic, future simulating, value ordering engines aimed at the highest good. What Kant postulated in the quiet of Königsberg, nature quietly confirms in the architecture of our flesh. We are not biological accidents adrift in a void. We are children of coherence, bearing within our living structure an inner glory that reason can now affirm with luminous necessity. I hope now, with the gravity of part 1, part 2, and this overview and deep dive into what we were talking about that entire time, I hope this all starts to make sense in the best way possible. And I will see you next time.